Imagine, during a big election, you open the paper and there's this huge story, one that could really sway people. And then, bam, you find out the whole thing was basically a political trick made to look like news.
Sounds like a conspiracy theory.
It actually happened, though. The Daily Telegraph 2015 UK election, textbook disinformation. And it's the kind of stuff we're going to dig into today. We've got these excerpts from a lecture all about, well, the tactics, the players, the whole world of disinformation.
Yeah, and this deep dive, it really makes you think about disinformation differently. Like where it comes from, who's spreading it, even how well it actually works.
Right, because it's not always so obvious. So this Telegraph case, they had this front page story about a letter supposedly signed by like 5,000 small business owners, all endorsing the Conservative Party. Pretty big show of support.
Seems that way, right?
Yeah.
But then activists found out that letter, it was actually cooked up by the Conservative Party themselves, their own campaign office, not some, outpouring from businesses. It was all made up. And to make it even worse, the Telegraph, they ran it as their top headline. Like it was the biggest news, gave it all this credibility it didn't deserve.
Makes you wonder, how often does that kind of stuff happen? We see a story, think it's, just how it is, but really it's a tactic planned out.
Exactly. And the Telegraph thing, it shows something important about disinformation. It's not always just lying straight up. It could be about how the information's shown, who's pushing it, where it appears.
Yeah, like a wake-up call. Got to be more critical of everything we read, especially during an election.
Absolutely. And that leads to this interesting concept, the idea that how we talk about, even analyze disinformation, it's actually construction.
Okay, that sounds kind of, well, complicated. What do you mean by that? Disinformation being a construction.
So it means the way we talk about it, it's shaped by, our existing ideas, biases even. Certain kinds of disinformation, they get all the attention, others are ignored. For example, anything from the political center that often gets overlooked. It's like we're only looking at certain players and ignoring others, which can, create a distorted view of the problem.
So we focus on the extremes so much that we miss what's happening right in front of us.
Yeah. And think about this. The idea that, pre-digital journalism, that was like the golden age of reliable news. That ignores stuff like what happened with the Telegraph. Manipulation, disinformation, it's always been in the media.
Right. We look back and think it was simpler, more honest. Yeah.
Exactly. And that nostalgia, it blinds us to the fact that disinformation, it's complex, it keeps changing, and it goes beyond just one political side or time period. It's been around forever, just adapting to new technology and, using our weaknesses against us.
This is kind of scary. If we can't even trust the, regular news to be objective, where do we even turn for good information? Feels like we're always unsure.
I get that, and that's why, critical thinking, it's so important now. We got to question everything, find different perspectives, and be really careful about anyone who says they're the only ones with the truth.
Good point. Makes me think of, you remember that document that got leaked?
Yeah.
From the NSA and GCHQ back in 2013.
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal. Changed how we see intelligence agencies and what they do online. Showed that they were, messing with online forums, using all these tricky tactics to sway public opinion. And it wasn't just terrorists they were targeting.
Right. It was like activists, journalists, even energy companies.
Yeah.
That line between, security and just plain spying, economic or political, it gets blurry.
It makes you wonder, right, how much of what we see online is it real people, or is it these powerful groups with their own agendas?
It is unsettling. And there's this idea that disinformation, it directly changes what people believe, their actions even. But do we actually know that's true?
That's where things get interesting. Research hasn't really shown that, people today are more easily swayed by this stuff than in the past.
Wait, so studies haven't shown that? That's a surprise. Why do you think that is? What does it tell us about how we're thinking about this?
Well, after things like Trump getting elected, Brexit, the tendency was to blame disinformation for those outcomes. Like, people must have been tricked into voting that way.
So easier to believe that than that people had, their own reasons for their choices?
Exactly. It oversimplifies things, ignores why people vote the way they do. And sometimes, saying disinformation is so powerful, it's a way to just dismiss opinions we don't like. So let's look at Brexit. Good example of how disinformation and voters, they interact.
Okay, yeah, both sides in that campaign, they used misleading stuff. Like the Leave campaign had that $350 million for the NHS claim, which we know wasn't true.
Right. And the Remain side, they also had their own, made up figures, like saying there'd be this huge budget shortfall right after Brexit.
So both sides were, well, playing loose with the facts. Like they thought voters wouldn't actually check.
That's a good point, and it shows us that just because disinformation's there doesn't mean it works. We can't just focus on if it's there. We got to ask, does it actually change what people do?
Right, so let's bust this myth that everyone's being tricked. What do surveys say after Brexit about how disinformation really affected voters?
But when you look at those surveys closely, they often twist the data to say that voters were, like, massively deceived. Some people did say the campaigns were dishonest, but that didn't mean they regretted their vote.
So you can know you're being lied to, but still stand by your choice. It's not as simple as saying people were tricked.
You got it. And it's interesting how those surveys were worded. They asked how dishonest the campaigns were, not whether people felt misled or changed their minds.
Subtle, but that changes how people answer for sure.
Exactly. It shows why we got to look beyond the headlines, dig into the data ourselves to really understand what disinformation does.
So if it wasn't the reason for the Brexit vote, what was?
One big thing was the divide between, the working class, who mostly voted leave, and the middle class who wanted to remain. This wasn't just about, being tricked. It reflected real anxieties, economic and social, that a lot of people felt.
So things like job security, wages, cost of living, things that really hit people hard.
Exactly. There's a story from the lecture that illustrates this well. A friend of the speaker, he works in construction, noticed that, all the European migrants coming in, it led to his wages not going up. Not that he was against immigrants, it was about the pressure, economic pressure a lot of working class people were feeling.
Makes you think policies that seem good overall can affect different groups in very different ways.
Right, and for the working class in Brexit, they felt like the politicians weren't listening to them. They saw the Leave campaign as a way to, shake things up, demand change. We can't forget about those realities when we analyze disinformation.
And it ties into the whole immigration debate, doesn't it? It's complicated. There are pluses and minuses, benefits the whole economy maybe, but can also push wages down in some areas.
You hit the nail on the head. And those negative effects, they often hit working class folks the hardest, the ones already struggling.
So we see how disinformation, it uses those real problems, anxieties, economic inequality. Doesn't always have to create something new. It just uses what's already there.
Absolutely. And that shows us that to understand disinformation, we got to understand the whole social and economic context it operates in.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Let's look at a historical case. It shows a darker side of disinformation, the Iraq War and the death of Dr. David Kelly.
Yeah, that one raises some serious questions about how far governments will go to control what people know and silence dissent. The invasion of Iraq back in 2003, it was based on the claim that Iraq had, weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
And as we all know, that turned out to be false.
And Dr. Kelly, he was a top weapons scientist, and he actually raised concerns about the intelligence they were using to justify the war. Then he dies, and it's suspicious. Officially a suicide, but there were all these weird things, unanswered questions that made people doubt that. Imagine, you're this top expert, you know the truth about why they're going to war, and then suddenly you're dead. They say suicide, but the evidence doesn't fit. Missing dental records, police reports they won't release, a knife with no fingerprints. More questions than answers.
Thrilling example. In this case, along with other things like that helicopter crash where the official story was, disputed, it suggests a pattern. Systematic disinformation, keeping information hidden. Evidence disappears. Documents are classified for years and years. People who disagree are silenced. Like truth itself is the victim.
Sounds like a conspiracy thriller, honestly.
Right. And that brings us to, conspiracy theories. What role do they play in all of this?
Good question. Are they always just nonsense, or can they sometimes, point to real issues that the mainstream media is ignoring?
That's important to consider. Sometimes these theories, they come up because valid questions are being ignored, dismissed, or even, actively suppressed. They could be like placeholders for inquiries that challenge the official story, but we don't have clear answers for. I remember this pathologist once said, "The truth is often found in the territory of the unspoken," meaning what they leave out of the story, what they hide on purpose, that can tell us just as much as what they do say.
Powerful. Reminds us to be skeptical, look beyond the surface, and pay attention to what's not being said.
And to watch out for people who try to dismiss legitimate questions or concerns as just conspiracy theories without actually, looking into the evidence.
Okay, so let's dig into some of the more, sophisticated ways they're manipulating information today. What are intelligence agencies doing these days?
They're increasingly using psychological operations, psyops for short, and tactics like, hacking and then leaking information, all to mess with online discussion.
We often think of that hacking and leaking stuff as, something Russia does. But Western agencies are involved too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where we start to see the ties to the military-industrial complex, that term Eisenhower came up with. It's about how the military, intelligence agencies, and corporations, they're all connected.
Like this, well, shadow network, working behind the scenes, influencing things, shaping the narrative to get what they want.
Not too far off, actually. And what's even more worrying is the role of big tech. Lately, it seems like they've been switching sides, aligning with different political groups depending on where they see their interests.
So not just governments calling the shots, it's this whole mix of corporations, political groups, intelligence, all competing for power and control.
You got it. And the COVID pandemic, it really brought this to light, showed us these crazy levels of government trying to control what was being said about disinformation.
It was a time of so much uncertainty. Governments really wanted to control the narrative and shut down anyone who disagreed.
Yeah. Governments were pressuring platforms to censor views that challenged what they were saying, even when those views came from real scientists. Early in the pandemic, I was all for lockdowns. I thought anyone disagreeing was being irresponsible, dangerous even. But as more information came out, I had to rethink some of my own assumptions. It was a good reminder to always be open to questioning what we believe and considering different viewpoints, especially during a crisis.
And speaking of questioning beliefs, the origins of COVID, that's been a whole other mess of controversy and disinformation.
Right. In the beginning, everyone thought it came from that wet market in Wuhan. But then that was debunked, and now even the Biden administration admits it probably came from a lab there.
It's complicated. Separating fact from fiction has become almost impossible.
And the irony is, while the U.S. was blaming China, they were actually funding research on coronaviruses at that very same lab in Wuhan. It's a tangled web.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how dangerous censorship is, how dangerous it is to try to control the narrative. Governments and these platforms, they were censoring like crazy during the pandemic, shutting down anything that challenged the official story.
Yeah, and now we've got the Twitter files showing that governments were actually pushing platforms to censor people who were questioning the pandemic response, even if those concerns were later proven right.
Scary to think about how easily free speech can be taken away, all in the name of national security or public health.
And let's not forget those so-called independent fact-checkers.
Ah, yes. The ones who are supposed to have all the answers.
Yeah.
But like that recent thing with Hamas showed us, even those sources can be influenced by the main narrative and fail to really investigate the information.
Yeah, October 2023, the New York Times, The Guardian, they were reporting claims of, like, systematic sexual violence by Hamas. Those claims were pushed hard by the Israeli government, but later debunked.
It exposes a real weakness. Even fact-checkers can be swayed. They don't always critically evaluate information, especially if it fits with the dominant political agenda.
So this deep dive, it's shown us a lot. Disinformation isn't just lies. It's about manipulating information, shaping what people believe, controlling what we see and hear. And it's happening on a huge scale, which is pretty unsettling.
Couldn't put it better myself.
Oh.
But don't get discouraged. The most important tool we have in this age of information overload is critical thinking. Question everything, look at things from different angles, and don't trust anyone who says they're the only ones with the truth.
Great advice. But I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. What stories have you accepted without questioning them? What information has been hidden from you? The search for truth, it never ends, and we all have a part to play.
Picking up on that, that idea of hidden information, disinformation, it thrives when people aren't thinking critically. And that's especially true when, there's fear, uncertainty, strong emotions flying around.
Yeah, it's like you're scrolling through, say, Facebook, and you see a headline that just makes you mad or scared. You're way more likely to share it without even, stopping to think if it's true.
Exactly. It spreads like wildfire because it plays on those emotions, our biases. It bypasses our ability to think clearly.
So how do we protect ourselves? Become more, savvy about the information we're taking in?
Well, first, we got to recognize our own biases. We all have them. And they affect how we see information. Like, if something confirms what we already believe, we're more likely to just accept it, even if it's not totally accurate.
And the opposite, too, right? If something challenges what we think, we might just call it fake news, even if it's legit.
Right. It's like we have these filters in our minds, screening out anything that doesn't fit our worldview. And those filters, they can be used against us by people spreading disinformation.
So how do we get past those filters? Become more, objective in how we think?
One way is to, actively seek out different viewpoints. Don't just read stuff that agrees with you. Challenge yourself to consider opinions you might not like at first.
Easy to get stuck in that echo chamber where everyone agrees, but that doesn't make them right.
Exactly. And remember, truth, it's usually complicated, there are nuances, rarely a simple answer, and almost always more than one side to the story.
So we need to be okay with not knowing everything, for sure.
Exactly. Which is tough because we humans, we like certainty. We want clear answers about what's right and wrong. But with information, it's rarely black and white.
Makes me think of that saying, the only thing I know for sure is that I know nothing.
That's a good attitude to have when you're dealing with all this information out there. Approach it with, humility, curiosity, and be ready to change your mind if there's new evidence.
And don't be afraid to ask questions. If something seems off, dig into it, do your own research. Don't just take what they tell you at face value.
Absolutely. And be extra careful about sources that are playing on your emotions instead of logic. If something makes you instantly angry or scared, that's a red flag. It might be trying to manipulate you, not inform you.
Like those clickbait headlines, meant to get you to click without thinking.
Exactly. They use our basic instincts, our fear, our outrage, to get us to read stuff that might be totally misleading, even harmful.
So we got to be aware of how we're reacting emotionally. Ask ourselves, why am I feeling this? Is this real, or are they just pushing my buttons?
Great questions to ask. Here's another tip.
Mm-hmm.
Pay attention to where the information's coming from. Who runs that website, that social media account? What's their goal?
Like that saying, follow the money. Who benefits from this information being out there?
Right. And don't just get your news from social media. Read different sources, including, the more traditional outlets.
But didn't we say earlier that even those can be full of disinformation?
True, no source is perfect. Even the good ones can make mistakes or have biases, but they're still important.
So it all comes back to being a critical reader, no matter where the information's from.
Yep. And here's a final tip. Don't be afraid to fact-check stuff yourself. Lots of resources online to help you see if a claim is true or if a source is reliable.
Yeah, websites like Snopes, PolitiFact, they do a lot of the work for us, debunking those myths and rumors.
Exactly. Fact-checking doesn't have to be a big chore. A quick search online can tell you if something's been debunked or confirmed by, multiple trustworthy sources.
It's all about being an informed and active citizen. Can't just sit back and take in whatever's thrown at us. Got to be involved, thinking critically about what we see and hear.
And be willing to speak up against disinformation when you see it. Don't just share something because it fits your story or makes you feel good.
Yeah, if you see a friend, family sharing something that's just plain wrong, don't be afraid to say something.
Those talks can be tough, but they're so important if we want to fight this. Disinformation, it needs silence to survive. The more we let it slide, the more it spreads.
We got to be the voices of reason, the ones defending the truth.
Well said. And it's not about just being right. It's about protecting our democracy, our society, even our shared reality.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about, well, this is a bit freaky, but the role of artificial intelligence in all of this.
Yeah, that's a big concern that's growing fast. AI, it's being used to make even more sophisticated disinformation, things like deepfakes.
For folks who might not know, deepfakes, those are videos where they take someone's face and put it on someone else's body, making it look like they're saying or doing stuff they never did.
Right. And they're getting so real, it's becoming harder and harder to tell what's genuine and what's fake.
It's like something out of a movie.
And a very real threat to, can we even trust what we see and hear anymore?
Makes you wonder, if we can't trust our own eyes and ears, what can we trust?
That's the question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It shows how badly we need new ways to, spot and fight these AI-made fakes.
As AI gets smarter, the disinformation's only going to get worse.
No doubt about it. We got to be ready. Investing in research, ways to detect this stuff, that's crucial.
And teaching people about deep fakes and all these AI-generated lies.
Awareness is key. The more people know, the less likely they'll be fooled.
And when people know, that'll put pressure on those social media companies and governments to actually do something about it.
Exactly. Got to hold those platforms responsible for what they allow people to share.
Because it's on them to protect their users from this harmful, misleading stuff.
And we need to, demand that governments actually create laws to regulate how AI is used to make disinformation.
Because this isn't just a tech problem, it's a problem for all of society.
Going to take all of us working together to solve it.
So let's stay alert, stay informed, and do what we can to stop disinformation in all its forms.
You got it. The truth is out there, but it's getting harder and harder to find.
And it's up to all of us to be the ones who protect it, who search for it, who defend it, and who share it.
Because the future of our democracy, our society, our shared understanding of what's real, it all depends on it.
Okay, let's talk about another trend, one that's kind of sneaky. Astroturfing.
Astroturfing, that's where, political groups, corporations, anyone with an agenda, they create these fake grassroots movements to push their ideas.
Like making it look like tons of people support their cause when really it's just, paid actors or bots.
Exactly. It works because we naturally trust what other people think, especially our friends and family.
We're more likely to believe something if we see, a bunch of people saying it's true.
Right. So these astroturfers, they make fake social media accounts, websites, online petitions, all to create this illusion of widespread support.
Like they're trying to trick the algorithms so their message seems way more popular than it really is.
That's a big part of it. And they use these clever tactics like
Huh.
targeted ads and influencers to reach specific people.
It's like a secret marketing campaign, but instead of selling us a product, they're selling an idea, a political agenda.
Perfect analogy. And they often use, emotional appeals, scare tactics, misinformation, all to get people to agree with them.
So how do we spot this astroturfing? What are the signs?
One sign is if you see this, like, sudden explosion of online activity about a specific topic, especially if it's coming from accounts that seem new or fake.
Like a ton of Twitter accounts all made the same day, all tweeting the exact same thing.
Yep, that's often a clue that something's fishy. Another sign is if the language is super emotional, over the top.
So we got to pay attention to like the tone, what they're saying, not just how many people are saying it.
Exactly. And if you're unsure about a social media account or an online campaign, do a little digging. Look at their profile, their posts, see if they're connected to any political or corporate groups.
It's like being a detective. Gather the evidence, see if it's legit.
That's the right way to think about it. Astroturfing is all about deception. They want you to think it's real people, grassroots,
Yeah.
when really it's all planned out and manipulative.
So being skeptical, thinking critically, asking tough questions, those are all essential tools for dealing with this stuff.
Couldn't agree more. Astroturfing is a threat to our democracy, our society, even our ability to, make good decisions based on real information.
Okay, let's talk about another, well, a really dark side of the internet. All the hate speech and harassment online.
Yeah, that's a growing problem, and it's having a terrible impact on people and communities everywhere.
Social media has become this breeding ground for hate and intolerance, giving these extremists a platform to spread their toxic messages to huge audiences.
It's true. And harassment online is becoming normal. People are abused, threatened, bullied just for sharing their opinions or who they are.
It's scary. It makes people afraid to speak their minds.
And it hits marginalized groups the hardest. Women, people of color, LGBTQ individuals.
Because they're the ones who are targeted most often, both online and offline.
And this abuse, it can be devastating for their mental health, their well-being, even their ability to, participate in public life.
So what can we do? How do we fight this hate speech and harassment?
First, we got to admit that it's a serious problem that needs a real response. We can't just ignore the trolls or tell people to get thicker skin.
We need to take action, hold people accountable, make the internet safer for everyone. So what actions can we take?
Well, social media companies, they got to step up, enforce their own rules against this stuff, be more proactive in finding and removing this harmful content, and make it easier for users to report it when they see it.
And they need to be more upfront about how they handle those reports.
Absolutely.
Right now, it feels like they care more about, making money than protecting their users.
That needs to change. It's their responsibility to make the internet safe and inclusive. And governments need to get involved too.
Yeah, they need to make laws, make online harassment a crime, give law enforcement what they need to investigate and prosecute these cases.
And work with the social media companies to find solutions that protect free speech, but also, effectively stop this hate and harassment.
It's a tough balance, but we got to find it if we want a more just and fair internet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we got to educate people about the effects of this hate speech and harassment.
Yeah, people need to understand that words have power, and online abuse can have real-world consequences.
And we need to encourage people to speak out against it when they see it happening.
Because if you stay silent, you're part of the problem. We got to stand up, not stand by.
And work together to build a culture online that's about respect, tolerance, empathy.
Because everyone deserves to feel safe and respected online.
Now, let's switch gears again. Let's talk about another form of disinformation that's everywhere. Propaganda.
Propaganda, that's basically spreading biased or misleading information on purpose to promote a political cause or point of view.
And it's been used forever to manipulate what people think, justify wars, silence people who disagree.
And it's still happening today. Governments, corporations, anyone with an agenda.
And it's getting more and more sophisticated, all thanks to the internet and social media.
Because those tools let these propagandists reach way more people. And they can tailor their message to specific groups, based on their demographics or psychology.
And it's easier to make it go viral through shares and those echo chambers we talked about.
So how do we spot propaganda? What are the signs?
One sign is if the information is like one-sided, totally biased, doesn't even acknowledge other viewpoints.
Like a news article that only shows evidence for one side completely ignores anything that contradicts it.
Right. Propaganda often uses cherry-picked data, twists the facts, uses emotional language to sway people.
And often uses fear, scapegoating, other manipulative tactics to make the opponents look bad and rally support for their cause.
So you got to be critical of anything that seems super biased or emotional.
And do your own research. Get information from different places.
Don't rely on just one news source or social media feed. See what different people are saying and challenge yourself to think critically about the information you're taking in.
And remember, propaganda is designed to manipulate you, your emotions, your beliefs. It's not about informing you, it's about controlling you.
That's a key point to remember.
So let's stay alert, stay informed, and think critically.
Don't let yourself become a pawn in someone else's game.
Okay, let's talk about another sneaky tactic. Gaslighting.
Gaslighting. That's a form of psychological manipulation. Someone tries to make you doubt your own mind, your sanity.
You're like trying to control and manipulate someone by making them feel like they can't trust their own senses, their own memories.
Exactly. And it works because it makes the victim less confident, more dependent on the abuser.
It's a form of abuse, emotional abuse, and it can really mess people up in the long run.
And it's often used along with other types of disinformation, like the propaganda and astroturfing we talked about.
Because it reinforces the abuser's story, makes the victim more likely to believe it.
Exactly.
So how do we know if someone's gaslighting us? What should we watch out for?
One red flag is if they constantly deny or downplay your experiences, your feelings.
Like if you tell them something they did hurt you, and they say you're overreacting, being too sensitive.
Or they try to convince you that you're remembering things wrong.
Like you have a clear memory of something, and they say it didn't happen that way.
Or if they try to isolate you from your friends and family.
So they can control what information you get and who you can talk to.
Exactly. Yeah. And they might try to make you feel like you're losing your mind.
Like saying you're paranoid or delusional.
Right. So if any of this is happening, it's important to get help.
Talk to someone you trust, a friend, family, therapist, or call a domestic violence hotline.
You don't have to go through this alone.
And remember, you're not crazy. You're being manipulated.
Is that your fault?
Now let's talk about, the impact all this disinformation has on us.
Being exposed to it all the time, it can really mess with our mental health, our well-being.
It can cause anxiety, stress, depression, even, PTSD.
Because it makes us feel like we can't trust anything. Anyone.
And like we're living in this world that's, chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous.
And it can make you feel isolated, lonely.
Because it breaks down our trust in other people, makes us feel like we can't connect with anyone.
Right. So it's important to be aware of these effects and do what we can to protect ourselves.
One way is to, just limit how much disinformation we're taking in.
We can do that by being careful about what news we read, who we follow on social media, what online groups we're part of.
And take breaks from social media and the news. Give our minds a rest from all that information overload.
And do things that help us relax, de-stress, exercise, meditation, spending time in nature.
And if we're feeling overwhelmed, anxious, it's okay to get help.
Talk to a therapist, a counselor, someone you trust.
It's okay to not be okay.
And remember, you're not alone in this.
Disinformation is a global problem. It's affecting millions of people.
But we can fight back.
We can be the voices of reason, the ones who defend truth, the ones who protect our shared reality.
Now let's talk about the role of, something crucial. Education.
Education, it's so important for giving people the power to be, critical thinkers, able to resist disinformation.
We got to teach people how to think critically, how to evaluate where information comes from, how to spot the signs of this stuff.
And we got to start early. Teach these skills in school from a young age.
Absolutely. The sooner we give people these tools, the better prepared they'll be to deal with all this information out there.
And this education, it needs to be available to everyone.
Workshops, online courses, resources that teach people how to spot and fight disinformation.
And we need to reach out to those who are especially vulnerable to this stuff. Seniors, immigrants, people with disabilities.
Because everyone deserves to have access to accurate, reliable information.
Okay, now let's talk about technology. What role does it play?
Technology, it's both a weapon and a shield in this fight.
On the one hand, it's being used to create and spread disinformation like never before.
But on the other hand, it can also help us detect and fight it.
There are, AI-powered tools that can spot fake news and other types of disinformation.
And some social media platforms are using algorithms to try and slow down the spread of harmful content.
And there are researchers developing new tech to help us, verify information and make sure sources are legit.
So yeah, technology is part of the problem, but it can also be part of the solution.
Now let's talk about journalism.
Journalism, it's so important. Holding power accountable, giving people accurate and reliable information.
In this age of disinformation, it's more crucial than ever to have a strong, independent press.
Journalists, they have to be relentless in searching for truth and willing to challenge those in power.
And be transparent about how they do their work, where they get their information.
And accountable to the public.
Because journalism, it's a public trust, essential for a healthy democracy.
Now, let's shift to the role of government.
Governments have a responsibility to protect their citizens from this harmful stuff, but they also have to respect freedom of speech.
It's a tough line to walk, but they got to find that balance.
They can fight disinformation by supporting independent journalism, promoting media literacy, and making laws that make it harder to spread.
And working with those social media platforms, finding ways to protect free speech while effectively stopping disinformation.
But we can't forget that sometimes governments themselves are the ones spreading disinformation.
So true. We got to hold them accountable too, be skeptical of what they tell us.
Okay, finally, let's talk about what we can do as individuals.
This fight needs everyone. Each one of us has a role to play.
We can start by being more careful about the information we consume.
Question everything. Evaluate sources. Check the facts.
And be mindful of what we're sharing online.
Don't share stuff that's clearly false or misleading. Be thoughtful about who we trust.
And speak up when we see disinformation happening.
Challenge friends and family who are sharing false stuff. Report it to the platforms, to fact-checking organizations.
And support the groups that are fighting this battle.
Donate to fact-checkers, media literacy programs, anyone who's doing this important work.
Because disinformation, it threatens our democracy, our society, our shared understanding of what's real.
But we can beat it if we work together.
So let's stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay active.
Be the voices of reason, the champions of truth, the guardians of our reality.
Because the truth is out there, and it's worth fighting for.
You know, stepping back a bit, it makes you think, how is all this disinformation changing how we even understand truth? It's a pretty philosophical question.
Whoa, now we're getting deep. But yeah, I'm curious. What do you mean?
Well, think about it, right? We're constantly hit with these different stories, conflicting narratives, alternative facts, outright lies even. It creates this feeling of, constant uncertainty. Pretty unsettling.
Yeah, like the ground's always moving under you. Hard to know what's real anymore.
Exactly. And that can lead to what we call an epistemological crisis, where we start to question the very nature of truth itself.
Hold on, for those of us who didn't major in philosophy, what's that mean? Epistemological crisis in this context.
Sure. It basically means a crisis of knowing. When we're always facing misinformation, different versions of the same story, it gets hard to figure out what's true. And then, you start to distrust everything, even sources that used to be reliable.
So instead of trying to find, the objective truth, we just retreat into our own little bubbles, accepting only what we already believe.
That's one way it can go, and it's a dangerous path. Leads to more division, less tolerance, even violence sometimes.
It's like we're all living in our own realities with no common ground to even talk to each other.
Exactly. And that makes it almost impossible to have real conversations, debate ideas, find solutions to, all the complex problems we're facing.
So what's the cure for this crisis of knowing? How do we get back to a shared reality, start trusting information again?
Tough question, but I think it starts with education. We got to give people the tools to think critically, teach them how to judge sources, spot the signs of disinformation.
Make people smart about the information they take in, not just passive, absorbing whatever's thrown at them.
Exactly. And we got to encourage intellectual humility.
Yeah.
Be willing to admit we might be wrong, consider other viewpoints, change our minds when there's new evidence.
Recognizing that none of us has all the answers. We got to be open to learning from each other even when we disagree.
Right. And we got to be patient. This isn't a quick fix. Trust, it takes time to build back. It needs effort from all of us.
But it's a battle worth fighting. The alternative is, well, a world where truth doesn't mean anything, it's just whatever you want it to be. And that's scary.
Yeah, more than scary, it's dangerous.
Well, this deep dive into disinformation has been, well, eye-opening for sure. We've talked about a lot. From the specific ways they spread it to how it messes with us individually and as a society.
It's a heavy topic, but I think talking about it is a good first step. The more we know, the better we can fight back.
And that's what this is all about. Giving you, the listeners, the knowledge to be smarter about the information you see, to challenge those false stories, to stand up for what's true.
The search for truth never ends.
Mhm.
There will always be those trying to trick us. But if we're aware, if we think critically, we can handle all the complexity of information and come out stronger, smarter.
So keep questioning, keep learning, keep fighting for the truth. Because it matters. It's the foundation of a fair and just world, and it's something worth defending. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, stay curious.